I would like to invite our second panel of great guests, and Sounil, of course, to lead it. We're going to have Grugq. We're going to have Dr. Rosanna Guadagno, Sara-Jayne S.J. Terp, David, we've already seen, and Perlman, and of course, Sounil, who will join us for this great thing and lead us forward through it. And on that note, I would just like to make sure that everybody understands that so far we have been involved with the ideas of policy and society. And now we would like to take it back down to what's actually going on, what we can actually do. And Sounil, please take it away.
Thanks, Gadi. And thanks for joining the panel. It should be a really lively conversation. There's a ton of interesting questions that got teed up during the first panel and what Michael also brought up. And so let's jump right in. But first, before we do that, let's go ahead quickly do introductions. I'll call you out, and then if you can just introduce yourself, that'd be great. So first, David.
Hi, I'm David Perlman. I have a background in tech and cognitive science. I've been working as a disinformation researcher since 2017, which is about the same time that a lot of people got started. Funny how that works. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thanks, David. Next will be Sarah. Can you introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm SJ. I've been working on disinformation for decades. I've been dealing with online disinformation since 2010 when I was running large-scale crisis mapping teams, so dealing with disinformation during disasters. 2016 onwards, have been working on online disinformation and adapting information security principles processes to deal with disinformation. So at the moment, running the CogSec CoLab, which is building tools, processes for volunteer teams to adapt, use for disinformation defense, and running the real-time live, we're actually doing it now, disinformation defense team as part of the CTI League.
Great, thanks, SJ. Grugq, thank you for waking up so early. I know that this is really early in the morning for you over where you are in Asia. If you can go ahead and introduce yourself, that'd be great, thanks.
Yeah, well, I think SJ might be the person who's doing disinformation longer than I am here. I started, I don't know, sometime after 2012 and before 2016. I was pretty actively involved. There wasn't a lot of people in the field. Since then, I've been moving around. Right now, I'm also with the CogSec CoLab, where basically I just provide emotional support to SJ. I don't do very much, but yeah, I don't know, to describe myself, I basically, I really like the description my sister gave of me to her fiance, which was kind of an asshole, thinks he's funny. That pretty much sums it up.
That's our in-house genius on disinformation defense.
That's funny. Well, that's the topic of this panel, so we'll jump into that in just a moment. So last but not least, Rosanna Guadagno, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Hi all, my name is Rosanna, and I'm a social psychologist. So I study what's typical for human social behavior. Because I've been a technology geek my entire life, my expertise starting over 20 years ago now is in how social influence and persuasion changes when the mode of communication changes from in-person to digitally mediated communication. So I've been studying that, like I said, since the mid-90s, and like so many of those of you, I started turning my attention to disinformation in 2016. And now I work at Stanford University, where I teach courses on psychology, influence, and propaganda, and also am coordinating a large faculty working group that has been studying information warfare for the last year and a half. And we have our first report about to come out sometime, hopefully before the 2020 election.
Okay, great. Well, throughout the conversation and your introductions, and even in the prior panels, there was a confluence of different terms that were thrown out there, and maybe you can help the audience understand some differences of terms that are being used. So David and Grugq, you mentioned cognitive security. Can you help us understand what you mean by that term and help us differentiate all the other words that we've heard, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, psychological operations? They all seem synonymous to the layman. So can you maybe give us some precision around each term?
Sure. I think we can both take a shot at that and provide slightly different perspectives. I'm coming from the cognitive side rather than the security side. And I think what a lot of people on both sides of that equation realized once everyone started talking about fake news, et cetera, all those other terms that you described, is that from a technology point of view, all platforms had always had to focus on content moderation and, you know, is this user misbehaving? Do we have to ban them? Do we have to censor this post? That had always been a thing. But when it became clear that there was an adversarial process going on where there were actually organized campaigns to, broadly speaking, abuse a communication channel, then it becomes a security problem because you actually have to fight back against someone who's doing something. But you're not fighting back with, you know, IP addresses and port scans and stuff like that. You're fighting back with narratives and things that take place in the cognitive domain. So that's where the idea of cognitive security comes from. So I'll hand it off to Grugq now.
I would actually hand it off to SJ, who is basically the grand queen mother of all things cognitive security. She was doing it before we had cognitive security as a term. Very, very briefly before giving it over, I just say that misinformation and disinformation are confusing, but actually fairly easy. Disinformation is deliberate and misinformation is a mistake. You might remember it with those, right? So essentially the issue with disinformation is someone is trying to accomplish a specific goal. Misinformation is where someone has incorrect information and they're sharing it. And one of the big problems with human beings is they basically love two things. One is they love to know more than other people, and the other thing is they love to share it with other people. So once a misconception, something wrong has gone out, the people that receive it now believe that they know more, and therefore they like to spread it, and that can be a problem. Propaganda is also a fairly easy one in that propaganda is any message where the intent is to the benefit of the person sharing the propaganda rather than the person receiving it. And I forget the rest, but I'm hoping SJ, you can take it up.
Okay, misinformation, disinformation. So people talk about fake news and they talk about fake information. So most disinformation isn't actually fake. And this is, I would throw this normally back at Grugq, but he's already thrown it back at me, so ping pong, whatever.
I'm going to cover that later. I've got a huge thing about that.
The falsehood is generally in things like the users are fake, the groups are fake, the framing of things like images and information videos are fake. You see things like shallow fakes. So one of the famous ones is slowed down videos to make somebody look like they're drunk. You don't see deep fakes that often because they're just relatively easy to disprove. Real information, badly framed, is much, much harder to disprove. Less real information plus people's imagination is much, much more powerful. Cognitive security. So this is the idea that there are different layers of information security. We've always had the idea of we're protecting our computers, there are networks, this is cuckoo's egg. You get this idea of hackers coming through the networks and we're protecting them, we're building firewalls, yada, yada, yada. So cybersecurity. You add to that physical security, people breaking into buildings, taking their keys and getting into the machines. And you add on top of that this idea of cognitive security, that why bother breaking into the machines and breaking into the buildings when you can just ask people for their passwords, or you can just get the information you want, or in the case of, I want to steal a country, please, you just break into people's heads and put in the information you want, or you confuse people, or you create conflict, you weaken your adversaries and go in and get what you want. So that happens on a geopolitical level. It happens on a business level. Now, David, with Pablo Brewer, who isn't with us today, but he's the fourth of a group of us that have worked on this for a while, have worked on the business level of this. So how this happens company to company. So ask him later about this. I've got a good black hat talk on that. There's also motivations of money and power. So in the current climate, pretty much all the stuff we're tracking back somewhere down the line is somebody making money. It's like selling t-shirts and drugs and clicks online. It's massively depressing because it's like, guys, please, something else. But it's all about, instead of computers being the endpoints, it's human beings. Instead of networks of computers, it's communities of humans. So there's your cognitive security, and disinformation, this idea that you're using real information, real people, but in a different way. It's hacking, but it's hacking at a human community and large-scale community as in country scale. Okay, back to you.
Thanks. So I think it's important for us to define these terms, partly because when we're trying to solve and combat this, it's important to know what exactly we're trying to combat. So one of the things that Grugq mentioned was this notion of misinformation being people, I guess you can call them useful idiots, spreading misinformation. So the question is to Rosanna, what are some of the ways that, what are things that people can do to prevent or protect themselves from spreading misinformation?
I think the biggest thing is to just get people to stop and check their sources before they spread information on social media. You know, we live in this world where it's cool to get famous on social media. It's cool to have things go viral. And I think a lot of times people get so focused on the idea of that rather than whether or not the information they're spreading is accurate and from a quality source versus not. And so that's the thing I tell anyone who asks me, first off, just stop and think before you spread. Stop and check.
So on that point, let me tee up a question for the group again. It seems like there's a balkanization of truth that's happening on the internet, where you have different people who are saying this is the source of truth. So how do we reconcile that issue where you have various sources that ultimately will say this is true, whereas another source will say this is true? So given that sort of balkanization, how do we address that issue?
You know, that's something I've given a lot of thought to, and I'd love to hear what everybody else thinks. One of the things that plagues me, especially as someone who remembers life before the internet and life with the internet, is how when I was a kid, if I wanted to know whether or not something was true, I might go to an encyclopedia. Now, I know history is written by the victors, but in general, we had this, everyone had an encyclopedia in their house or in their school library, and we could go find the same general information. And with the way that the internet allows us to search for information, we no longer have that uniform system. And so sometimes I wish we could find a way to get back there or push to there in the future so that at least there's some foundations that most people will agree on as accurate.
We're certainly talking a lot about that in the counters community. So we're talking to people like the AAAS are talking about how do you build a better information society? It's not enough to remove the disinformation. It's not enough to stop people pushing out these huge flows of emotion and information. And some of the, I mean, we're just looking at the narratives coming out across COVID and the floods of narrative coming out. Countering all of those individually isn't enough. What we have effectively, especially in places like the US, are information deserts. There are whole areas where you just cannot find the information that you need. And you need this double thing of take out the pollution that's happening across our information environments, but also make it easier to find the good stuff. And there's been some good work from the platforms where if you look up certain terms like COVID-19 and certain terms, you will find they'll put up a link to something like the WHO page. So there's some work starting that's looking promising there. I realize I'm talking too much. I'm going to pass that over.
No. I was just going to say, actually, based on one of the things that you have brought up earlier is that huge amounts of disinformation and propaganda are not actually based on false statements. They're based on misrepresenting true statements. And one of the ways it's very difficult to counter that is, as the saying goes, facts are stubborn things. So the problem is, if you have a fact, but one person has one interpretation and someone else has a different one, and what you're trying to do is not necessarily say this fact is wrong, because it's a fact. What you're trying to do is trying to say the interpretation that you have is wrong, and that's a much harder prospect, because it's very hard to convince people that their opinions are wrong.
Yes.
They really, really don't like that. So that's basically the thing I put out, is that it's quite difficult to eradicate this. So as SJ was saying, and I believe Rosanna brought up as well, the important thing is not just cleaning up the information environment, it's actually populating it with quality information, so that people actually have, like they're eating good info, not just a junk food diet. Anyway,
Yeah, so
that's, yeah.
Yeah, so
I'm
Richard,
gonna,
go ahead, David.
Sunil, do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
So I've been watching the comments. I don't know if those are coming from the audience or from the other panelists, but I think that we're looking at, even internally here, we're looking at an interesting sort of debate going on over the nature of truth. And, on the one hand, you have some kind of people who are saying, yeah, but facts are stubborn things, like Grugq just said, and that goes all the way back to philosophical skepticism. And I'm not good with my philosophers' names, but the person who said, I refute it thus, and kicked the rock. It's like, the rock's there. You can believe whatever you want, but if you kick a rock, your foot isn't going to go through it. And if you burn down a 5G tower, it's not going to protect you from coronavirus. But you can believe whatever you want. And, people have really gotten into this idea of opinions. This is the comment that I want to respond to. It is true that opinions cannot be wrong. Like, if you say, my opinion is that blue looks better, it is true that my opinion is that blue looks better. But if I say my opinion is that 5G causes coronavirus, it's true that that's my opinion, and it's not wrong that that is my opinion. But the fact that I am referring my opinion to absolutely can be wrong. And if you care more about your right to have an opinion than you care about the underlying facts, then you're really lost. And this is, in the spirit of, we're not trying to politicize this, this is actually one of the few areas where I am able to be politically neutral. I'm really not very good at being politically neutral, but by God, everyone right now is so in love with the idea of opinions and identity and, my right to express myself and validation, emotional validation, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of rocks to kick that don't go away when you kick them. And that's why I think a lot of us are really feeling like this pandemic is an opportunity to actually dramatically improve the conversation around fake news, et cetera, this topic. Because it's kind of the rock that when you kick it, it doesn't go away.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we can try to improve upon this is by changing how the news itself is portrayed. And Richard Marshall and David Weber brought this up earlier, where we no longer have clear delineations or distinctions of what's opinion versus actual news. So this question's for Rosanna. Are there any sort of policies that should be reconsidered or should be considered in being able to combat misinformation or disinformation? Should we revisit some of these changes that we've made in law that enable news organizations to be able to mask what's opinion versus news? What are your thoughts in terms of policy-oriented changes?
I think in general, we need to have policies where there's more transparency and clarity in general in the way that we interact with both news as well as people online. So one thing I would love to see is a world where there's a better distinction between what's fact-based, what's opinion-based, what's a real person who's been, say, verified in the Twitter sense versus an account that's a bot. I think that it would help people kind of wade through the information a little bit more easily and tell what's true and what's not. There's still going to be cognitive biases. There's still going to be the tendency for people to rely more on their shortcuts when processing information, but just transparency and labeling has shown, at least in studies, some benefits to helping people reduce the amount of misinformation they believe. So that's one place I'd like to see.
So we teed this up a moment ago as well. So what should be the role of big tech? If big tech is part of the propagator of this, what sort of actions can big tech do to be able to stem the flow of misinformation that goes out?
I think that to the best of their ability, they've been doing quite a bit since I'm in Silicon Valley, and I often work with these companies and talk to these companies. They're doing the best that they can, but they have limited information in terms of who their users are, because they can only see what digital footprints they leave. So it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between an account that's legitimate versus not, at least initially. But over time, once they do, then they try to weed that out. I like quite a bit that some of Twitter's new policies with respect to labeling when information is false, allowing you to report when it's spreading misinformation, especially about an election. So they're making good strides. But the thing, my soapbox is always virality. If it were more costly to make the information go viral, then people would be less likely to do it. And my hope is that at least if people want to spread disinformation, it would cost them more in time and effort and possibly money if it were harder to go viral. If social media companies could determine a business model that wasn't based on free access in exchange for our data. Unfortunately, we're kind of at that point where everybody loves the free access in exchange for their data, so it might be hard to move people to a different system. But I think that people need to be the customers of social media more so than used for marketing and advertising purposes. And on that note, I'm also going to have to restart my computer because I'm having lag issues, which you probably already can see. So I'll be back in a moment.
Okay, great. So actually, Gadi, you have something?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to jump in here for a second and say that I appreciate this panel a lot in the direction you guys are taking, because we're bringing it down a level. I would challenge this panel to actually take it even to a lower level and tell us what can be done and what can be done now by individuals, by companies, by nations. What are the tools available? What are the methodologies available?
Yep. Yeah, so let's jump into that. So we'll talk about one of the initiatives that SJ is working on. SJ and the group actually is working on, called AMIT. So maybe SJ, can you talk a little bit about AMIT, what it is, and some of your rationale behind creating it?
Okay, so we were looking at counters, and we were looking at different types of counters. So one type of counter is just looking at all the types that already exist. Everything from the take down the IRA's internet through to the educate people with things like war on pineapple. Another way is to look at what disinformation is from the point of view of the person creating it. And the way you can look at that is to look at disinformation campaigns as though they're marketing gone wrong or gone bad. And you can look at disinformation incidents as though they're incidents in any other type of cyber threat intelligence, and break those down into the stages that somebody creating disinformation would go through, from the initial strategic planning all the way through the types of content they would have to create, the types of accounts they would have to create, the types of setup they would have to do, through to the initial generation, then through promotion, pushing out of information, through to the final keeping it persisting and monitoring evaluation. So we built a model based off PsyOps models and marketing models and other disinformation models we could find at the time, called AMIT. It's a 12-step model for the 12 steps that we believed that disinformation creators would go through. And the reason we built this was we wanted to disrupt each of those steps. And we listed out the techniques that we believed would happen at each of those steps, or could happen at each of those steps. So we have things like micro-targeting as a step. So paid targeting ads is a technique within that. Exposure is a step. Twitter bot amplification is a technique within that. But this is idea of left of boom, right of boom. Most of the work we were seeing at the time was worrying about how you deal with disinformation after it's hit the public. That's right of boom. That's after it's hit the networks and gone broad. We were interested in, can we do things about disinformation before it gets there? Can we spot early signals? Can we spot people setting up and start dealing with it then early? And this is what we're doing in practice. We're looking for those early signals. We're looking for ways to deal before it hits public, before it gets out. So it's like somebody's setting up hashtags, somebody's doing test runs, somebody's setting up accounts. Can we deal with that? So this is Amit. And for each of those stages, we then looked at, there's a military set, and I'm just going to read off because I can never remember the 7Ds. So there are a set of countermeasure types. So detect, find things, deny, stop somebody getting into your network. In this case, stop them getting into your system, your human system. Disrupt, you want to interrupt the bad guys getting through your system, in this case, your human networks. You want to degrade, you want to slow them down in some way. So things like the work on WhatsApp, only allowing so many messages per hour. That degrades the ability to flood a whole network. Deceive, diverting them. So honeypots, setting up fake documents, setting up fake groups, just getting the bad guys to go put their effort somewhere else. This is something that Grugq's done a lot of work on. Destroy, just damaging their effort. If you can find their botnets, remove their botnets, they've got to go put all the work into building them again. And deter, just discourage them from doing it in the first place. A lot of the guys we're seeing at the moment are doing it for money. If we can take out those financial incentives. And one of the things I was doing last year was working at GDI, and we were looking for the paid sites so we could report to ad tech and get them removed from ad tech networks. So are our botnets all bad? Not all bots are bad. There are some really beautiful art bots out there. And there are bots looking for conflict boundaries, trying to find the people who need to be reached as part of the rebuild. So not necessarily, but there's a lot of bad ones out there. But there's a sense of, okay, how do we both at that tactic level, that stage level with these 7 different ways to counter, but also then down at those individual technique levels, counter. And then there was a second layer of countering, which I'm going to throw straight across to Grugq, because he's the master at this, which is doctrine-based countering. This idea of the other guy has resources, you have resources, they have infrastructure, and you're starting to work out how to exhaust their resources, their infrastructure. Sorry, G.
Oh, no, but you better be sorry, because I don't want to talk about any of that.
Oh, okay.
I have excellent historical examples I want to bring up, because I find them hilarious, and they're so much cooler than theoretical things when you could say, this is stuff that actually happened, and these are the results, and from our remove, we can joke about it, but at the time it was deadly serious. So I'm going to do that, and people are just going to have to read about AIM on their own, which they should do, because it is a good framework, and I contributed by adding a change of phrase. So it's no longer a useful idiot, it's ignorant agent. It's a bit more neutral. So that's my contribution to the disinformation framework. All right, so one really cool counter that I want to talk about is it happened just before World War II. So actually quite a while before World War II, in the 30s. So some people are probably aware of the Reichstag fire, which is how the Nazis came into power. Basically, the Reichstag was like the political building where the Congress met or whatever, and it got burned not particularly badly, but it got burned. And that night, Hitler and some of his goons showed up, and they started creating the, like basically they made a propaganda. So the narrative that they put out was that the destruction of the Reichstag was done by communists. And the only way to protect against communists was to give Hitler more power so that he could fight them. And that ended up being sort of the pretext on which he took over. So that was the first propaganda, okay? So the reality is the Reichstag was burned by this very crazy Dutch guy who was a communist, but none of the German communists would let him join their groups because they all thought that he was a spy. Nowadays, we can look back, we could say he's probably just schizophrenic and had very, very serious problems. For example, when he showed up to burn down the Reichstag, he didn't actually have any flammable stuff with him. He only had petrol. So in order to burn, in order to get cloth to burn so that he could set fires, he took his clothes off, right? This guy was not very prepared. You know, we're not talking about a very high level, you know, advanced, sophisticated attack. This was one schizophrenic burning his clothes, running around naked through the Reichstag, and it was put out and everything was fine. Again, as I said, the Nazis used that to create the idea that there was a communist plot and the only way to defeat it was to get rid of the communists. The only people who could do that were the Nazis, which, you know, technically that's true. They did get rid of the communists pretty well. But the interesting thing is in France, the communists fought this. And the way that they did it is basically they judoed it. So they pulled it even more. So they took the Nazi propaganda and said, actually, this goes a layer deeper. What happened was the Nazis false flagged the fire in the Reichstag so that they could then pretend it was the communists who did it. And if you talk with people these days, there's people who actually still think that the true story of the Reichstag fire was that the Nazis set it as a pretext, right? That's the power of propaganda. It lasts forever. If you've got a good narrative, and you know, this is a great narrative. It's like these guys went out and they cheated everyone just to take over power, and they used, you know, lies and deceit and all that. It makes sense. That's what we want to believe. And that's how that initial propaganda was countered, by basically flipping it around, saying it wasn't the communists who were to blame, it's the Nazis blaming the communists. And what helped that was that the propaganda being put out by the Nazis was in fact false. Like, it was literally propaganda. Therefore, the communist propaganda against it could point to the fact that this was propaganda being used. So that is an awesome historical thing that I like.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So let's actually dive into this notion of a weaponized narrative and using the word weapon itself as a key word. How do you disarm that? How do you what's the opposite? Diffuse a weapon? To David.
You cut the red wire. Well, no.
You nudge it. We're talking about strongly held beliefs, not truth and falsity. You nudge. David, this is your area.
Hang on. Before that, I'm just going to say nudging, but the other one you can also do is co-opting. Particularly if it's a marginalized narrative, you can adopt it and integrate it into a larger one and smother it. David.
Yeah, I think what you just said is getting more into the territory of what I think is effective. I think that one of the things you really have to look at here is how this relates to group identity, which has come up a number of times. I think for the most part, people believe things because they identify with a group, and then a much smaller part of their mental processing is involved in, yeah, I say the things that people in my group say. So if you have, I mean, this doesn't make it a simpler problem, but just to pick one little part of it, if somebody, say, a hostile foreign power, let's just keep it at that, is weaponizing a narrative and creating a demographic that holds beliefs that are harmful to the integrity of our country, then you know, they're believing those things because it becomes part of a group identity to believe those things. So this suggests, now we're at, this is the first time I'm actually going to say something about an active countermeasure. It's, you don't necessarily have to teach them different facts to believe, because the only reason they're believing those facts is because it is part of a group identity. And building a group identity from scratch is the hard work for the adversary. So if you can interfere with the process of creating a coherent identity, then it can fall apart on its own. Like people, I mean, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, QAnon wouldn't be fun for people if it weren't for the sense of camaraderie. You know, if everybody on QAnon was arguing with each other all the time because they all disagreed with each other about exactly how QAnon worked, then it wouldn't be fun and it wouldn't be so compelling. You know, the cults don't foster debate. Part of the thing about a cult is that there is a wisdom that is handed down from above and you buy into it so that you are part of the group. And if you debate, then you're not going to be a part of the group. So if you have ways of fragmenting the identity of a hostile or artificial, or, you know, whatever you want to call it, some sort of group where the identity is being used to foster adversarial / weaponized disinformation, I personally think that, at least from a practical point of view, is the kind of, it's the kind of like getting a little leverage into a crack that you can use to take a stab at this problem. Of course, it doesn't help at all with this whole other spate of questions of like, who is the one that actually does that, which is equally a problem either way.
So I have something to tack on to that. I agree with everything you just said, David. And I'm thinking about some of the classic research in my field of social psychology that looks at, well, how can you reduce conflict between groups? Because, you know, the ways our brains are wired, it's human nature to divide the world between us versus them, my group, my category, and theirs. However, what's defined as your group or category varies widely by context, time, and place. So just, I'm going to apply it to what's been going on in American culture because that's my expertise. So right now we have all sorts of divides that have been amplified by a lot of the disinformation we've seen. And that's been harmful. You know, everyone I know has some story about some way in which this new world has affected their friendships and their family relationships. But at the end of the day, if somebody, say a charismatic leader perhaps, were to remind us all that at the end of the day, we're all Americans and we all believe in that value, what it can do is get two sides to start to come together and focus on the similarities that make us Americans or human beings or what have you. And that's the way to get groups across these divides to start to cooperate with one another.
You know, I have to jump in and just say I'm not an American, even though, to be honest, growing up in Hollywood and American culture, I guess we all feel a little bit American. You wouldn't feel that. But we are the world, if we're to go to extreme here, is the, I guess, what is the DC thing without taxation without representation? Are we taxed? I don't know. Got back on point, though. I'm going to put on my operational hat, which hides my eyes, but that's okay. And I'm going to take it all the way down, okay? When I started working on this many, many years ago, I didn't know what I was doing, but about 5-6 years ago, I started looking into this. And I'm stuck, you know? What do I do? I know how to create an attack operation. I know how this works psychologically because Rosanna collaborated with me and Dr. Cialdini on that. But how do I stop it? And I got stuck on 3 points. Point number one was if I try to do anything with the same weapon, at that stage is what I thought, I'm attacking and not the right group, so I'm not achieving much. Then I went and started looking at operations. Okay, we take down the bots, but then I take down my intelligence source, and also they'll just shift around and we'll walk into the usual arms race we go into in security. And 3, how do I actually build a defensive mechanism? Now, I have my own opinions, and I'll share them a little bit later. I love Amit, by the way. It covers something different, although along the same lines. But for me, I just want to go down here into the weeds and say, what can be done today? I'm a CISO of an organization. I am the head of a nation. I am a person. What can I do today, planning-wise or operationally, to get this better? I'm going to take my hat off, and back to you guys.
Well, I got a list of about 200 things in our repo.
Give me two. Give me two.
Okay, as a person, go and look for your old accounts. Please, God, I have about 20 old accounts. Go see if any of those are being used in botnets. Simple stuff like clean your shit out. Make sure that's not part of the problem.
So fair enough. So let's take it a step further, right? So if, you know what, I'll talk about my project for a second. So as part of ACOD, a conference /on defense, artintoscience.com, woohoo, which Sounil and I are working on, we created working groups. We're trying to create RFC-like projects, meaning trying to push the art into science by creating methodologies. And one of these around what we call CNI. Back in the 90s, the military in the US called, like, they still like field manuals, but they put information warfare together. There was CNE and CNA, computer network attacks and exploitation, together with PsyOps, psychological operations. And that was separated. And I was for that. I said, what do these things even have to do with each other, right? And then Estonia 2007 happened. And I already worked on these things before, around 2002-03. But I was like, this is not computer information. You know, for example, this is not just about attacks. I remember when the Estonian parliament was under attack, and they actually use their email. You know, when the mail server was being taken down. And Hiller, the Estonian cert manager, kind of drew a line in the sand and said, no, we're not going to let that happen now. Why? If you look at management strategies, if you look at military strategies, you can immediately see that a website for the president, who is the equivalent of the queen, not to offend him, but he's not the person running the country, the nation, has 20 visits a week. You can defend banks. Why would you try to draw a line in the sand for the server? On the other server, the mail server, right, under attack. So these two things are happening. I would like to compare them. So with the presidential mail server, they said no more, and they stopped it. So the hackers in all the groups, well, people really in all the groups that were being engaged to attack Estonia, said no, let's take it down. Now dare they? And they continued doing this, continued bringing the server back up, taking it down, bringing it up, and they gave up and they moved on. That said, on the other hand, if you look at policing strategy, if you look at broken windows theory, this holds because you took away their will to do this. But if I look at military strategy, concentration of force, I would like to concentrate on the banks. Or wrapping up with this, Macron, he actually, not him specifically, by himself, went and responded to these types of threats, right? Making sure that the minute the information was released about him, he could show in the same news cycle, this is fake, and move on from it. What else can we do? What are interesting cases? What are counters we can use in context here to show people this is part of our jobs and how we go about it?
You raised a whole bunch of interesting stuff like the PsyOps, CNI, CNA, CNO, and I'm going to bring up my personal thing, which is I really hate splitting these things up because it takes people who should have broad knowledge and gives them very narrow knowledge. And it creates the idea that, you know, computers and information and people are all distinct things that can be attacked independently by different types of people, where the reality is basically, you know, the super information highway is about information, right? It turned out it wasn't about computers, it was about information. And it turns out that you don't actually need like CNA. You can get away with Facebook pages and, you know, a few Twitter accounts. You know, you don't have to be as sophisticated as, you know, TAO or Sandworm or any of these other guys who can do very, very sophisticated technical work, but, you know, information is what actually matters when you're trying to sway people. Uh-oh, 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's okay. So, you know, Steve Crocker actually, who was here last week, one of the founders of the internet who started ARPANET, told me that in the very first meetings, when they talked about, you know, what is this for? Why are we creating this network for? they all came to the conclusion back then, no social networks. Networks are for people. They connect people.
Absolutely. So this is like I'm doing quite a lot of work on cyber warfare these days, and I'm very much out on a limb in the way that I'm approaching it. So I won't get into any of it here, but rather than using the idea of these like little small types of things like CNI, like CNO, or whatever, rather than doing that, if we just understand what we're trying to achieve and then how we can use cyber to achieve it, it gets, I believe, very interesting. So that's my strategic cyber stuff. But yeah, like in terms of like technical counters of what we can do, I think one of the things that the platforms need to do is they need to add sort of more information to the accounts that people engage with, right? Because I'm of the opinion that you cannot patronize your audience. You cannot patronize people and say, you know, the problem is that you're just not educated enough. You need to get educated and you won't believe this bullshit, right? That's people will shut off on that. You have to sort of trust them to interpret and to process and do sense making on the information that you give them. So from my point of view, just give them more information that is useful and valuable. One of the things that Twitter did, I was suggesting it to them, and it turned out they already had a program to do that. But it was, you know, a lot of the fakes that happen on Twitter would be recontextualized images. So they take an image of one conflict, you know, like a bomb going off in Syria, and then they would recontextualize it and say, you know, like, look at what just happened in Iraq, this car bomb.
Yeah, so this is exactly the point I was kind of trying to make for the panel, where, Justin Soumeni, who couldn't be with us today, I was talking to him about a year or two ago, and he created a control for his organization back then. So for example, if you have, what happens if your actual organization is attacked, but not necessarily on the outside world, such as happens in China and India all the time right now, such as I'm closing down the company tomorrow from the CEO on Twitter, right? But rather your employees are, right? Different types of attacks. So one of the things he's been working on, and hoping I don't destroy his words here with mine, is how can I create the trusted channels to my employees? So let's talk about, so my approach, for example, which is a little bit different from Amit, is about the kill chain. Meaning if I cannot understand how I am to build a defensive mechanism and I know how the attack mechanism works, I will go attack stage to attack stage and see what controls can I put in stage for that attack. So for example, for this, a lot of organizations today have a control in place where they say, you are not to talk on social media. You are not to discuss this on social media. That's a control right there. We can put through distribution or through the message creation. Another control, we can decide this is too big. Let's take the risk of legal action. Let all our people talk so we can overwhelm that message or put our word in. So looking at these types of controls for me, and not necessarily staying with the 5 Ds, but adding in inform, adding in relationships, adding in understanding of data are things we need to look at. So what are other things we can do today as an organization? I'm a CISO, I'm a Chief Information Security Officer, or I'm head of PR. What do I need to do today? What are things I can accomplish today to combat these things you're describing?
Forewarning, teach my employees what to expect. If you let people know what to expect and you also combine with that some guidance in terms of how you expect them to respond, it can do a lot to help people become prepared for any disinformation they're going to experience, and that forewarning can actually help them build resistance to it.
Yeah, I mean, you need to at least, similar to phishing, you need to war game what you're likely to have. So it may be personal, it may be company. You need to think about what types of attack you're going to get, what types of surfaces you're going to get here. But sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that point and reinforce it a bit. So there's been a bit of the last couple minutes of the thread of this conversation have perhaps broadly been what you could categorize as private questions, like maybe corporate questions around disinformation, internal corporate security, which is a bit of a shift from all this talk about Westphalian nation states and education and massive social networks and stuff like that. And I think a lot of us in this community, we all know each other, including Pablo and I in our Black Hat talk, have been trying to tell the corporate, the private sector security community, look, if you're not thinking about this now, you're going to have to think about it sooner than you like. And everybody is so preoccupied with Russian election hacking, et cetera, et cetera. We have a big election coming up in America, and everyone is rightly very concerned about it. And I think that part of what that means is that people don't really have the bandwidth to think about the private sector stuff. But I just want to, here in this public forum, go down on record and say, I think that you're going to find that after the election is over, when the dust settles from that, which hopefully won't take any longer than the 2000 election did. In any case, after the dust settles from the election, I think then you're going to find people are going to take a step back and start looking a lot more at these sort of internal communications issues, and maybe even realize that there were things going on all along that they missed because they weren't looking for them.
So I want to, before we wrap up, I have one other question before we wrap up. So I want to go back to this notion of sources of truth. And a example that we have from the internet where we've had challenges in being able to reconcile sources of truth. And one of the examples that comes to mind for me is certificate authorities. You have different countries that maintain certificate authorities. And so who's to say Russia, when they issue www.google.com, is not truly google.com? We've had that issue in the past. And so we came up with techniques like certificate transparency to be able to understand when somebody is disseminating misinformation, perhaps. I'm not sure if I used that correctly, but anyway. So the question here is there a parallel like that? Could we actually come up with the notion of a certificate authority for truth, or at least for bona fide news agencies, where we can somehow validate that the source of information came from a particular location and that there's some sort of progeny for that bit of information? What are your thoughts? Is that something that we can do?
There are already certificate authorities out there.
For truth?
There are for fact-checking. So there are authorities at the domain level who check that sites have specific things done, like
So we're talking like the fact checkers and so on and so forth?
Yes.
But do we have any technical means by which we can somehow stamp an article or stamp some, is there a technical means that we could potentially introduce that provide some sort of understanding of here's what
blockchain?
No.
This is what I was doing last year. So GDI, we were looking at the article level. So we were looking at domains and we were looking at disinformation domains, but also disinformation versus information domains. And we were looking at, could you actually do this at the domain level and at the article level? And the answer is it's incredibly difficult, and you're not going to be able to do it just with machine learning. You need to use humans. Always you need to use both.
Yeah, I would just add to that if I was an attacker and I discovered that you were doing domain level truth, I would be willing to put in 1 or 2 years of being completely factual if it allowed me to do 2 days of pure disinformation with a truth stamp. Well,
that's what we were doing. So what we had was the idea of junk domains, which were basically the conspiracy, batshit crazy. And we never tagged for disinformation. We tagged for things like bias. So we tagged for things like targeting, because tagging something as disinformation is really hard. But there were also quality domains that carry disinformation. And for those, you mostly need to use human fact checkers. And you can never use just one fact checker because humans carry their own biases. So you need to use a team. And preferably you need to use a mixed team. And you need to be very careful about how you tag. And that was my story of last year.
Yeah.
Mostly trying to get that right, both the algorithms and the tagging and the human parts.
So one thing that when you work with SJ for a while, one thing you get used to is that when someone asks the question, well, why isn't anyone just doing X, Y, and Z? That she may well have already been doing it for a while. And if you're still asking the question, that means that it was a really hard problem, not that no one thought of it yet.
Yeah.
It's
So,
complete.
Yes.
I don't want to say
point.
too much about, for various reasons, which companies that I've been at or whatever, but to provide a little bit of a platform-centric perspective here. And I mean, I don't want to, I think that what Grugq is saying, the security perspective of how things like that can be undermined and weaponized by adversaries is probably the most important point to keep in mind. But at a secondary level, I'm also going to add a platform perspective, which is that the head of YouTube took a lot of crap a few years ago for saying at a press conference that it was easier to decide if something was abusive than it was to decide if it was true. And everybody was like, well, how can it be hard to decide if objective facts are true or not? And the answer is that the whole process is hard because of a whole spate of reasons. And if you say that something is factually, objectively true, then if you're even slightly wrong, then you have failed completely. Whereas if you say something that is abusive and you're slightly wrong, you haven't failed completely. So like the fact that it is black and white actually makes it a harder problem at the production level. Whereas philosophically, you might think it would be an easier problem. Although I think the point about people disagreeing about the concept of truth shows that there's also a philosophical question there. But it's very hard for any sort of organization, and not for the political reasons of, who gets to decide what's true, just for practical logistical reasons. It's way, way harder than you would think to start labeling things in terms of what is actually true. And we're getting towards the end here, and I don't think anybody wants me to rant on that topic alone, but I'm really in danger of going off the deep end on why exactly it's so hard to decide on that.
Well, as
to sum up, YouTube is not the arbiter of the nature of truth.
Yeah,
On that, I think all of us could agree.
All agree, yes. Well, as Pontius Pilate says, what is truth, right? And I think that's fundamentally
Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia
Yeah.
what's in the world.
Well, so we're out of time. Let me wrap up with this one last question, and this was really for the benefit of Michael, who showed us that preview earlier. For his upcoming movie, he wanted feedback from us. If we were the target of that campaign that he was characterizing in that trailer, what counter would you use? So let's start with SJ.
Oh God! I actually went and got coffee during the trailer.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll skip you. We'll skip you for a moment then. Grugq, how about you?
I actually, I got to side with SJ.
Oh, right, you joined
basically
later.
Just woke up.
Got it. All right.
It's 4:30 in the morning. I didn't do anything at that time.
All right.
So why don't you give a little bit of a framing of the question and just
if you give us a rundown.
So the framing of the question, the trailer was about this these two friends. One friend challenged the other friend to ruin his life, right? And so he went about. There's all these different aspects of the movie where he basically created these different narratives that made his life quite miserable on social media. And I forget the specific details of each one, but there's a whole flood of different things that people are doing to bombard your life with things that will make it pretty miserable. So that was the basic backdrop of the movie, or at least the scenario that we saw in the trailer. All right.
I reach for my Terry Pratchett at this point.
Your what?
There's Terry Pratchett. There's this wonderful scene in Terry Pratchett where the witches are caught between mirrors. And one of the witches goes crazy trying to work out which one she is. And Granny Weatherwax just looks down and goes, yeah, this is me.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure if I got the reference, but it's okay.
Well, it comes.
Who you are, you just look down and go, this is me.
Philosophically, it's the same as you kick the rock. If you don't know what's true, just go kick a rock, and then that gives you some ground to stand on. Is this a trick question? That's a funny question. Every question is a trick question when you're talking about disinformation. I would go in sort of the same direction. The very first thing I think of is that as a general rule of psychological manipulation, no one can control you unless there's something that's more important to you than letting them control you. So if they have something you want, your reputation or, you know, your paycheck or whatever, then they can control you. But if you decide you don't want that thing anymore, then they can't control you anymore. So at some point, before you get too deep down the rabbit hole of, you know, whatever garden path this campaign is leading you on, and this is not necessarily generally applicable. This is kind of more specific to the one-on-one campaign in the movie. But you can just stop caring. Like, you don't have to listen to what they're saying anymore. I mean, if they're like the trailer hinted at people killing people. I mean, if somebody comes to your house with a gun, then you have a problem that is not a disinformation problem. You have somebody came to your house with a gun problem, and the way that you address that involves a lot of traditional. Actually, Grugq can tell you a lot about your physical OPSEC that you should deal with, probably more than anyone else in the world. So there's that, if people are actually going to go that far. But just on the information, the internet side of things, you just can sort of stop caring.
Yeah, so actually, Michael gave me some specific, more specific guidance in terms of what question he wanted to ask us. So if you had the attention of 100 million people, what would you give them as an action item?
With respect to the film, or in general, which, by the way, the film, I can't wait to see it.
Pump and dump stocks or something?
Yeah.
Buy Bitcoin. But wait a minute.
It's in relation. It's in relation to disinformation.
Okay, can I say what I would do, because I've seen the trailer twice today, and I love this subreddit No Sleep. It's creepy and fun, so I can't wait to see the movie, and I've been thinking about it since I saw the first trailer. So if I were the guy who was being plagued by his friend in that way, I would do a couple of things. First off, I'd notify my authorities that somebody was targeting me with this kind of slander campaign or disinformation or whatever we want to call it. So that the authorities would be more suspect when evaluating any evidence that suggested I was guilty of a crime. So forewarning works really well with people. And then the second thing is I would try to set up a compelling counter narrative that would verify where I was at all times, so that when photoshopped information suggested I committed a crime, I might have, I wouldn't use tech. Tech is too easy to fake. I would use real people. I would always make sure I was with others so that there would always be a witness to what I was doing everywhere, and multiple witnesses as possible. Also, because when you look at jury decision making, eyewitnesses tend to be more compelling than facts anyways. So that's how I would do it as somebody who studies social influence and persuasion. And I would still think the poor kid would be screwed. Excuse me.
There's actually a political candidate who did that recently, made sure they were always accompanied.
Yeah, you need multiple eyewitnesses to verify your presence can override fabricated digital technology suggesting otherwise.
But yeah,
in general, narratives are much more compelling to us than other pieces of information, and the most vivid narrative is one that is told in person by another individual.
But these are stories, and people are made of stories, and people relate to stories. You tell a more powerful story. Ultimately, absolutely. The strongest thing against the story is a more powerful story.
And one of the ways to work on that as well is to prematurely put out stories that you can then debunk, which will, if over time people get the idea that every time there's a crazy story that comes out, it always turns out to be made up.
Yeah.
When another story not by you comes out, people will already have discredited this genre of narratives as being like, most of the time, this is just garbage that comes out. So whatever.
That's a great idea, because it plays to the ways in which we're both consistent in the way we process information, and also it confirms our expectations about life. So if we expect it to be false and then something crazy comes out, we just discount it because it confirms what we already expected.
And you know, to take this somewhere, which I mean, avoiding politics generally is the idea, but getting now at the end, I'll take a risk and give an example. So if we're to compare the Macron campaign versus the Hillary Clinton campaign, when the information was released, seems critical. So this is of course conjecture. We can't know what the adversaries actually did, but because there was stuff that would interest the news and interest the public, then I would say it was released early. And with Macron, it was released just before the media blackout because there was nothing really there that would interest people. But that's kind of a take that I've seen flying around. But I think Grugq wanted to say something.
Yeah, so I'm like in the post-mortem from an Atlantic Council, I am identified as having called out exactly what was going to happen about 6 weeks before it did. And it was immense, like it was immediately very, very obvious what was going to happen because Macron is basically too young to have a lot of skeletons in the closet. The few negative things they tried to put out about him just hadn't stuck. And so whatever they were able to collect was not going to be very good. Like it just, there wasn't going to be much that they could use from it.
It's like they tried to use the very fact of the release itself to create the noise.
That's the only thing that was left is that because they had, like it's a simple thing, like if the facts aren't on your side, pound the table. That's what they did, right? They didn't have any facts, so they just made a big noise and hoped that it worked.
But looking at young, I must be younger than Macron because if you look at my Facebook and I was American, I would never be president. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
well, you might have said that about the president. I mean, anyway.
I want to go back to the. So
yep. So right, SJ.
Yes, I must have mangled Michael's question, so apologies. He put it on chat. Let me reread it just for the folks who are who don't have the luxury of reading chat when during the recording. So the question that he meant for me to ask was, what action item should we as a company give to the world?
As a part of the release of this movie, which gives them a bit of a platform.
Right.
And I think that I'm going to have to fall back on just a different framing of the same thing, which is if you're going to remind people of something, remind people that the internet isn't everything. You know, don't live your whole life in the internet. Don't put all of your weight of your, you know, your self-esteem on your Instagram profile. Find something else to care about yourself with respect to. Unplug every now and then and notice that there is actually a rock that you can kick, or whatever, you know, whatever metaphor you want to use. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of channeling Tristan Harris here from the Center for Humane Technology, but just unplug a little bit, I guess.
For me, be kind. Just try to be kind. That's been forgotten too much.
Jumping off of that. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
I read a lot, so I recommend doing that. Like books don't change all that much. They're pretty static, pretty good. So I read and then I show up on Twitter and make fun of stuff. That works for me.
Rosanna?
So echoing similar sentiments, people need to remember that not everything you see and read on the internet is true. And that should be our expectation for the internet in its current incarnation. But the one thing that is easier to see and true and maybe more tangible are the friends and family and people in our lives. And sometimes we get so caught up in arguing online that we forget the people we love and their feelings and what's important to them. And so I recommend be kind to everybody, strangers and friends, but also spend some time with the people in your real lives, because it may be easier to talk to people online, but at the end of the day, who matters? Our friends, our family, the people we love, and respect them, value them, and be grateful, and accept the fact that sometimes you will have differences in opinions, and that's okay.
And my suggestion would be to tell stories that inspire and not diminish. So I think much of what we see in the narratives is really to diminish. And so if we can shape the narrative to be one of inspiration, I think that would be that would take us a long way. All right, with that, thank you very much for our panelists. It was a wonderful conversation. And let me now turn it back over to Gadi.
Thank you, Sounil. Appreciate it. And thank you all. I mean, SJ, David, Grugq, Rosanna, you guys have been amazing and I truly appreciate it. And you, of course, Sounil, for being the best moderator who always does the low-key thing and makes sure everything just goes in the right direction. And I just appreciate you guys coming on, honestly, and Grugq doing it from 4 or 5 a.m. over there. I can feel the pain and appreciate it. So saying appreciate enough, also need to acknowledge, of course, the first panel, Malka, who led the amazing conversation around policy and society, John Randon. We have had also Professor Brennan Allenby, Richard Marshall, and of course our special guest, David Weber. Then we have Michael come on with the trailer, and that was amazing. Thank you very much for that. And on that note, next week, we're gonna join the ladies of urban fantasy, the masters of urban fantasy, Charlene Harris, Patricia Briggs, Dana Cameron, and Tony L.P. Kerner, also known as Lee Perry. And we're going to talk about, Charlene is gonna interview Patricia about a new book, Smoke Bitten. And we'll also have a world building panel with these lovely experts on writing and on narrative. And we may even see pets. They might even share pets. So we appreciate you. Thank you for coming on, and we'll see you next week. This was,
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Essence of Wonder.